Bring me someone smarter. The billionaire snapped, his voice cutting through the elegant dining room with such force that every conversation stopped at once. Yet the only person who didn't flinch was the waitress carrying a silver coffee pot. The silence that followed felt heavier than the crystal chandeliers hanging above the private executive lounge of Hawthorne House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where billion-dollar negotiations were treated as casually as ordering dessert. Ethan Walker stood beside a conference table covered with financial reports, legal folders, and glowing laptop screens. At 39, he had built one of America's fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies, and people often described him as the kind of man who solved impossible problems before breakfast. Today was different. Today, every solution seemed to create another problem. Across the room, executives shifted uneasily while two software engineers stared helplessly at a projection screen displaying numbers that refused to make sense. The presentation scheduled for an international investment group would begin in less than 10 minutes. Yet every revised forecast contradicted the previous one. One decimal point appeared correct in one model and completely wrong in another. Revenue projections changed every few seconds. Risk assessments refused to synchronize. Nothing matched. Ethan rubbed his temples, then slammed a folder shut. I don't need excuses. I need someone who actually understands what they're looking at. Bring me someone smarter. No one answered. Several employees lowered their eyes. The restaurant manager forced an awkward smile, clearly wishing he could disappear behind the polished oak walls. At that exact moment, Claire Bennett quietly approached with a fresh pot of coffee. She wore the standard black and white uniform every server wore, her blonde hair neatly tied back, her name stitched in small silver letters over her pocket. She looked like someone customers would forget moments after paying the check. Calm, professional, invisible. She gently refilled a coffee cup without interrupting anyone. Ethan barely noticed her. His attention remained fixed on the chaotic spreadsheets glowing across 3 separate monitors. This meeting determines whether hundreds of people keep their jobs, he muttered. There has to be one competent person in this room. Claire glanced toward the projection screen for only a second. Her eyes moved across columns of numbers, formulas, and color-coded charts with surprising focus before returning to the coffee cups in front of her. She said nothing. Around her, conversations resumed in anxious whispers. One attorney quietly suggested postponing the meeting. Another executive proposed simplifying the presentation and avoiding the disputed figures altogether. Neither idea satisfied Ethan. He hated delays almost as much as failure. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath the afternoon sun while luxury cars rolled past the restaurant entrance. Inside, however, every passing second tightened the pressure. One investor checked his watch. Another closed his laptop with visible disappointment. Ethan noticed every gesture. Confidence was disappearing from the room, and he knew experienced investors could smell uncertainty faster than opportunity. Claire collected empty cups and placed them carefully onto her serving tray. Before turning away, she looked once more at the projection screen. This time she noticed something none of the specialists seemed willing to question. It wasn't the software. It wasn't the formulas. It wasn't even the financial model. It was the assumption everyone had accepted before opening the spreadsheet. She remained silent. A waitress had no reason to interrupt a room full of executives. She had learned long ago that people rarely welcomed wisdom from someone wearing an apron. Yet as she reached the doorway, Ethan's frustrated voice echoed through the room once again. 5 minutes, he said. After that, this deal walks out the door. Claire stopped with one hand resting lightly against the polished wooden door. She took a slow breath, looked back toward the conference room, and spoke so softly that several people almost missed the words. Sir. Every head turned toward her. Ethan looked up with visible impatience. Claire met his eyes without fear, without arrogance, and without raising her voice. The problem isn't your system. Claire's quiet words lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a keyboard. Even the soft piano music drifting through the restaurant suddenly seemed distant. Ethan stared at her with open disbelief, as though he had forgotten she was standing there only seconds earlier. His expression was not curious yet. It was impatient. What did you just say? He asked. Claire balanced the silver coffee pot against her hip and answered with the same calm tone. I said the problem is not your system. One of the software engineers gave a nervous laugh. With all due respect, miss, this is an enterprise forecasting platform built by our development team. Claire nodded politely. I believe you. The engineer folded his arms. Then you also understand that it is impossible to diagnose it by looking at a screen for 5 seconds. Claire did not challenge him. She simply looked back toward the projection. I was not looking at the software. Ethan stepped closer, studying her face for the first time. There was no trace of panic. No attempt to impress anyone. She looked exactly like she had looked while pouring coffee a minute earlier. Steady. Professional. Almost invisible. Then what were you looking at? He asked. Claire glanced toward the charts. The assumptions behind the charts. The room became quiet again. Ethan frowned. Explain. Claire hesitated. She was surrounded by executives wearing tailored suits, attorneys carrying leather portfolios worth more than several months of her paycheck, and analysts whose careers depended on the presentation scheduled to begin in only a few minutes. She had no title, no credentials hanging around her neck, only a serving apron and a tray resting against the side table. I could be wrong, she said honestly. Then be wrong quickly, Ethan replied. Claire slowly walked toward the projection screen. She did not touch the laptop. She did not ask anyone to open another program. Instead, she pointed toward a small line near the top of the financial summary. Every projection below this line depends on one assumption. Several analysts leaned forward. Ethan followed her finger. The customer retention rate, he asked. Claire nodded. Yes. One executive interrupted. That number comes directly from last quarter's verified reports. Claire smiled gently. It comes from last quarter's reports, but this presentation is forecasting next year after your new subscription model launches. She looked around the room before continuing. You are treating existing customers and future customers as though they behave exactly the same way. Silence. One analyst blinked twice. Another quietly reopened his notebook. Ethan looked back at the screen, then toward his chief financial officer. Is that true? The chief financial officer hesitated. Technically, the model does use one blended retention assumption. Claire continued before anyone could interrupt. That would have been reasonable before the pricing structure changed. But after the rollout, your newest customers will behave differently from long-term enterprise clients. If the assumption is blended together, every projection below it will look unstable even if every formula is mathematically correct. Nobody spoke. The software engineer slowly walked to the keyboard and examined the model again. His fingers moved across several tabs. Then another. Then another. The confidence on his face quietly disappeared. She is right, he whispered. The formulas are not failing. Another engineer leaned over his shoulder. Within seconds his eyes widened. The formulas are recalculating exactly as designed. The source assumption is wrong. Ethan remained completely still. The tension that had filled the room moments earlier transformed into something else entirely. Confusion gave way to curiosity. Curiosity slowly became respect. Claire stepped back from the screen as though her part was already finished. If you separate your legacy clients from new subscribers before forecasting future revenue, the presentation should stabilize. She reached for the coffee pot again. I should return to my tables. Ethan did not answer immediately. For the first time that afternoon, the billionaire who had built an empire by trusting only experts found himself staring at the quiet waitress who had solved in less than 1 minute what an entire conference room of specialists had failed to understand. The chief financial officer quickly pulled a chair beside the lead engineer, and together they began separating the customer groups exactly as Claire had suggested. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards while graphs refreshed one after another. The red warning indicators that had dominated the screen only moments earlier quietly disappeared. Revenue curves stabilized. Forecast ranges aligned. The conflicting projections that had consumed the entire afternoon suddenly made perfect sense. One analyst leaned closer to the monitor, almost afraid to believe what he was seeing. The confidence intervals are holding, he whispered. Another executive compared the corrected charts against printed reports and slowly nodded. Everything matches now. Ethan said nothing. He had spent years surrounding himself with graduates from the nation's best universities, industry consultants, and financial experts whose opinions carried enormous price tags. Yet the breakthrough had not come from any of them. It had come from the woman who had entered the room carrying fresh coffee. Claire gently placed the empty pot back onto her serving cart, and started collecting used cups as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She did not wait for applause. She did not explain her reasoning any further. She simply returned to the quiet rhythm of her work. Ethan watched her for several long seconds before speaking. "Miss Bennett." Claire turned politely. "Yes, sir." "Stay." She paused. "My tables still need me." The restaurant manager stepped forward immediately. "I will cover them." Claire looked uncertain. She had never been invited to remain inside a private executive meeting before. This room belonged to people whose watches cost more than her annual salary. She quietly folded her hands in front of her apron and waited. The software engineer finally leaned back from the laptop with an expression that blended embarrassment and admiration. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. "I assumed you did not understand what you were talking about." Claire offered a small smile. "That is all right." "No," he replied honestly. "It is not. I dismissed you before listening." His words settled over the room more heavily than anyone expected. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances because they realized they had done exactly the same thing. Ethan slowly walked toward the projection screen. He studied the corrected graphs before looking back at Claire. "You recognize the flawed assumption without opening the model." "Yes." "How?" Claire hesitated for only a moment. Sometimes people become so focused on checking their calculations that they forget to question the first decision they made. Ethan looked at the financial summary once more. "You saw the foundation before you looked at the building." Claire nodded. A correct answer built on the wrong assumption will always lead people in circles. The room became quiet again, but this silence felt different. It no longer carried panic. It carried reflection. A notification suddenly appeared on Ethan's tablet. The international investors had arrived in the main reception area 5 minutes ahead of schedule. Every executive instinctively looked toward him, waiting for instructions. Just 20 minutes earlier, they had been preparing to postpone the meeting. Now they were ready. Ethan closed the tablet and took a slow breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his confidence returning, "we proceed exactly as planned." Relief spread across the room. People gathered folders, adjusted jackets, and organized presentation materials with renewed energy. Before leaving, Ethan turned back toward Claire once more. "One more question. Of course. If you had not spoken, would you have watched us present incorrect projections?" Claire answered without hesitation. "No." "Why?" She looked briefly toward the conference table before meeting his eyes again. "Because I have learned that staying silent is polite. But staying silent when someone is about to make a preventable mistake is not kindness." Ethan held her gaze. For the first time that afternoon, he did not see a waitress standing before him. He saw someone whose quiet confidence had changed the direction of an entire meeting, and somewhere beneath the calm expression on Claire's face, he began to suspect there was a story far greater than anyone in that room had imagined. The conference room transformed within minutes. Anxiety gave way to purpose as assistants distributed updated presentation packets and analysts replaced outdated charts with the corrected forecasts. Every revised page reflected the change Claire had suggested, and with each new printout the numbers became more convincing. Ethan stood near the head of the polished walnut table, watching his team regain the confidence they had nearly lost. Yet his attention continued drifting toward the quiet waitress standing respectfully near the doorway, waiting to be dismissed. She had not asked for recognition. She had not reminded anyone that she had solved the problem. She simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that the room belonged to others. The lead attorney walked over carrying the revised financial summary. "The risk exposure has dropped by almost 12% under the corrected assumptions," he said. "These projections are considerably stronger." Ethan accepted the folder without taking his eyes off Claire. "How long would it have taken us to find this on our own?" The software engineer answered honestly. "Hours, possibly days. We were debugging formulas that were never broken." Ethan slowly nodded. He knew exactly what that meant. If the meeting had begun on schedule with the original presentation, the investors would have questioned every inconsistency. Confidence would have disappeared. Months of preparation could have unraveled because everyone had trusted a flawed starting point. A gentle knock interrupted the room. The restaurant hostess stepped inside. "Mr. Walker, your guests have arrived." Ethan thanked her and looked around the room. "Everyone ready?" Confident smiles replaced worried expressions. One by one, the executives nodded. As they prepared to leave, Ethan surprised everyone by turning toward Claire once more. "Would you walk with us to the entrance?" Claire blinked in surprise. "Sir, I am only serving this section. Today." "Today?" Ethan replied quietly. "You did much more than that." She hesitated before agreeing with a small nod. Together they walked through the elegant hallway lined with framed photographs of visiting dignitaries, celebrated chefs, and business leaders. The marble floors reflected the warm afternoon light pouring through towering windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Staff members glanced curiously toward the unusual group. It was not every day a billionaire entered an investor meeting beside a waitress instead of a senior executive. As they approached the reception lounge, the international delegation rose to greet Ethan. Firm handshakes were exchanged. Courteous introductions followed. Claire instinctively stepped aside, intending to disappear back into the background where she felt she belonged. Before she could leave, one of the investors noticed her name tag. "Miss Bennett," he said with a friendly smile. "Thank you for the excellent hospitality." Claire smiled politely. "You are very welcome. I hope you enjoy your afternoon." Ethan watched the brief exchange with quiet interest. There was something remarkable about the way she spoke. Every sentence sounded thoughtful without trying to sound impressive. Every movement carried calm instead of urgency. She seemed completely comfortable receiving neither attention nor praise. The meeting soon began inside the private executive suite while Claire returned to the dining room. Within minutes, she was once again carrying plates, refilling iced tea, and recommending desserts to afternoon guests who had no idea she had just influenced one of the largest business presentations taking place in Manhattan that day. Her coworkers greeted her with puzzled expressions. "Where were you?" one server whispered. Claire smiled gently, helping with a misunderstanding. "The manager looked terrified," another joked. "I thought somebody important was complaining." Claire quietly folded a linen napkin before placing it beside a dinner plate. "Sometimes people are only looking at the wrong problem." Her answers sounded simple, but those words stayed with the young server long after Claire walked away. Upstairs, inside the executive suite, Ethan began his presentation with unusual confidence. The revised numbers flowed naturally from one slide to the next. Questions from investors were answered clearly. Concerns disappeared one by one. As the discussion continued, Ethan realized something unexpected. The strongest part of the presentation was no longer the technology his company had built. It was the clarity of the thinking behind it. And every time another chart appeared perfectly aligned on the screen, he remembered the quiet waitress who had noticed what every expert had overlooked after looking at the evidence for only a few seconds. Nearly 90 minutes later, the conference room doors opened once again. The atmosphere had changed completely. Laughter replaced anxious whispers. Handshakes lasted longer than formal etiquette required. Several members of the investment group complimented Ethan on the clarity of his presentation, describing it as one of the most transparent financial discussions they had attended in years. As the guests made their way toward the private dining area prepared for lunch, Ethan remained standing beside the conference table for a quiet moment. He looked at the final presentation still glowing on the large screen. Every successful chart, every confident answer, every approving nod from the investors could be traced back to one observation made by someone who had never been invited into the meeting in the first place. The chief financial officer approached him with a satisfied smile. "They are interested in moving forward." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know. This could become our largest partnership in 3 years." Ethan closed the presentation on the monitor. "It almost became our biggest mistake." Downstairs, Claire carried a tray of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and fresh lemonade through the afternoon crowd. She greeted every customer with the same warm professionalism she had shown before the executives ever arrived. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had influenced a multi-million-dollar negotiation. She thanked guests, cleared plates, and quietly polished silverware between tables. Her world had returned to normal. At least that was what she believed. Ethan entered the main dining room a few minutes later. Several restaurant employees immediately noticed him walking through the room without his executive team. They expected him to head toward the exit where a black luxury sedan waited outside. Instead, he stopped beside Claire as she placed a dessert menu in front of an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. He waited patiently until she finished speaking with them before saying a single word. "Miss Bennett." Claire turned with the same composed expression she always carried. Congratulations on your meeting, sir. Ethan studied her for a moment. You already knew it went well. Claire smiled softly. The people who walked out were smiling instead of checking their phones. That usually tells the story. Ethan almost laughed. You notice everything, do not you? Claire shook her head. Not everything. Just the things people accidentally reveal. Before Ethan could respond, the restaurant manager hurried over, clearly worried that something might be wrong. Mr. Walker, I hope everything has been satisfactory. More than satisfactory, Ethan replied. Actually, I would like to borrow Claire for a few minutes if that is possible. The manager looked toward Claire, then back at Ethan. Of course. Claire hesitated. I still have 3 active tables. Another server immediately stepped forward. I have them covered. Claire thanked her colleague before following Ethan into a quiet lounge overlooking Central Park. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, filling the room with a calm golden glow. Ethan gestured toward 2 comfortable chairs, but Claire remained standing. I am fine here, she said politely. Ethan did not insist. You solved a problem that nearly 20 professionals could not solve. Claire answered simply. Everyone was looking inside the spreadsheet. Nobody stepped back far enough to question why the spreadsheet existed. Ethan folded his arms. Where did you learn to think like that? Claire looked toward the window for a brief moment before answering. Life has a way of teaching people to question first impressions. It was an honest answer, but Ethan sensed it was only part of the truth. He had spent years reading people during negotiations, and he recognized the quiet discipline of someone carefully protecting a much larger story. She was not hiding out of pride. She was hiding out of necessity. The realization surprised him. Most people rushed to display their achievements the moment they received attention. Claire seemed determined to do the opposite. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Ethan spoke again. You know, most people would have introduced themselves before offering advice. Claire smiled faintly. Most people are not serving lunch during a business meeting. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan realized the greatest difference between them was not wealth or status. It was that Claire never needed recognition to know her own worth, and that quiet confidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment, as though weighing how much of herself she was willing to reveal to a man she had only met a few hours earlier. Outside the lounge windows, yellow taxis rolled through the afternoon traffic while sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Midtown Manhattan. Inside, the quiet between them felt almost as important as the conversation itself. Ethan noticed that she never rushed to fill silence. She seemed comfortable letting people think before speaking. That alone was unusual in his world. You answered my question without really answering it, he said with a faint smile. Claire returned the smile politely. Sometimes that is because the full answer belongs to more than one person. Ethan respected the boundary immediately. He had spent enough years negotiating to recognize the difference between secrecy and privacy. They were not the same thing. Fair enough, he replied. Then let me ask something simpler. Did you study finance? Claire shook her head. No. Business? No. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Then how did you understand a forecasting model better than people who work with them every day? Claire looked toward the city skyline before answering. Because numbers tell stories. Most people memorize the math. I learned to understand the story first. Ethan remained silent, inviting her to continue if she wished. After several seconds, she quietly added, I studied systems engineering before life changed my plans. Those few words carried far more weight than their simplicity suggested. Ethan did not interrupt. I loved solving complicated problems, Claire continued. Not because I enjoyed difficult equations. I liked finding the one small assumption everyone else overlooked. She smiled softly, almost to herself. My professors used to say that the hardest problems usually begin with the easiest mistakes. Ethan folded his hands together. Why did you leave? Claire looked down at the wedding band. She wore on a thin silver chain around her neck rather than on her finger. It was old, slightly worn, and clearly precious. My father became very sick during my junior year, she said quietly. My mother was already working 2 jobs, and tuition became impossible. Someone had to make practical decisions. Ethan noticed she never described herself as a victim. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only acceptance. So you left school. Claire nodded. I promised myself it would only be temporary. A gentle laugh escaped her before she continued. Temporary has lasted 6 years. Ethan found himself imagining the countless interviews she must have attended, the opportunities she had quietly watched disappear, and the invisible weight carried by someone whose abilities were hidden beneath a restaurant uniform. "Did you ever think about going back?" he asked. Claire's expression brightened just slightly. "Every day." "Then why have you not?" She answered honestly. "Rent arrives every month. Medical bills do not disappear because someone has dreams. Reality usually asks to be paid first." Ethan looked away for a moment. Those words struck him harder than any dramatic speech could have. He had built an empire solving complex business problems, yet he rarely stopped to consider how many remarkable people never received the opportunity to show what they could do. Claire had not lost her intelligence. She had simply lost access to the places where people expected to find it. A soft knock interrupted them. The restaurant manager stepped inside, looking apologetic. "Claire, I am sorry to interrupt, but Table 12 specifically requested you. They said nobody explains the menu quite like you do." Claire smiled warmly. "I will be right there." Before leaving, she turned back toward Ethan. "Thank you for listening." He shook his head gently. "No, thank you for speaking." Claire gave one small nod before quietly walking back toward the dining room. Ethan remained standing beside the window long after she disappeared. He replayed every conversation from the afternoon, but one thought refused to leave his mind. The most valuable person he had met that day was not wearing an expensive suit, carrying an executive title, or sitting at the conference table. She was carrying dinner plates through a crowded restaurant while the world continued mistaking circumstance for capability. For the first time in years, Ethan realized that talent did not always wait inside corner offices. Sometimes it waited beside a coffee pot, unnoticed until someone was willing to look beyond the uniform. The afternoon slowly settled into its familiar rhythm. The lunch crowd thinned, sunlight stretched across the polished hardwood floor, and the quiet clinking of dishes replaced the tense conversations that had filled the restaurant only hours before. Claire moved from table to table with the same gentle efficiency she had shown every day for years. She remembered regular customers by name, noticed when an elderly gentleman needed extra time reading the menu, and quietly brought a small bowl of water for a family traveling with a service dog before they even had to ask. To everyone around her, she was simply an exceptional waitress. Nobody could have guessed that earlier she had quietly redirected the course of a negotiation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Upstairs, however, Ethan's thoughts refused to return to quarterly forecasts or investor reports. Even after the meeting concluded successfully and contracts were scheduled for final review, his mind remained fixed on a single question. How many other people had he overlooked simply because they stood in places where nobody expected excellence? He walked into the private lounge where several members of his executive team were discussing the next phase of the partnership. "Excellent recovery today," his chief financial officer said. "We were fortunate." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No, we were fortunate because someone chose to speak." The room became quiet. "Find out more about Claire Bennett," Ethan continued. One vice president smiled knowingly. "Background check." Ethan looked directly at him. "No." The executive seemed surprised. "Then what exactly are you asking for?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I want to know what she wants for her future, not what happened in her past." The difference between those two questions hung quietly in the room. It was not an investigation. It was curiosity without judgment. Downstairs, Claire finished her shift just as the evening staff began arriving. She carefully folded her apron, thanked the kitchen crew, and clocked out at exactly 5:30. Instead of heading toward a luxury apartment or an upscale neighborhood, she walked 3 blocks to the subway station carrying a faded canvas backpack that had clearly been repaired more than once. Ethan happened to leave through the front entrance just in time to notice her disappearing into the flow of commuters instead of stepping into a waiting car. Without thinking, he watched from across the street as she purchased a subway ticket rather than calling a rideshare. There was no performance in her choices. She simply lived the life circumstances had given her. Curiosity quietly replaced assumption. The following morning, Ethan arrived at his office overlooking the Hudson River before sunrise. His assistant placed the day's meeting schedule on his desk, along with a slim folder. "This came from Human Resources," she explained. Ethan opened it expecting a resume or employment history. Instead, he found only a single sheet of paper. The restaurant manager had politely declined to share any personal information about Claire, explaining that employee privacy mattered unless Claire herself chose otherwise. Ethan smiled unexpectedly. "Good," he murmured. His assistant looked confused. "Good." Someone respected her enough to protect her story. He closed the folder. "Leave it there." Throughout the morning, Ethan found himself comparing that simple act of loyalty with the culture inside many corporations, where personal information often became another business asset. The contrast stayed with him. Around noon, he canceled a lunch reservation at an exclusive private club and instructed his driver to return to Hawthorne House instead. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Business meetings, sir?" Ethan looked out the window as the city passed by. "Perhaps," he answered quietly. "Or perhaps I simply owe someone a proper conversation." When he entered the restaurant, Claire was arranging fresh flowers on the hostess stand before her shift officially began. She looked up, surprised but completely composed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker," she said with her familiar warm smile. "Welcome back." Ethan returned the smile with a sincerity that felt unfamiliar even to himself. For the first time in many years, he was walking into a conversation without an agenda, without a negotiation, and without trying to convince anyone of anything. He simply wanted to understand the quiet woman who had reminded him that the brightest minds do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they wait patiently for someone willing to see beyond the uniform. Claire welcomed Ethan with the same calm professionalism she offered every guest, as though yesterday's extraordinary events had never happened. She led him to a quiet table beside the tall windows overlooking Central Park, placed a glass of ice water in front of him, and handed him a menu with an easy smile. "Would you like your usual coffee?" she asked. Ethan looked up with mild surprise. "You remember?" Claire nodded. "Dark roast. No sugar. You only drank half a cup because you were too focused on your presentation." Ethan smiled. "You notice more than financial models." Claire answered softly. "People reveal themselves in ordinary moments." She stepped away to place his order, leaving Ethan quietly reflecting on how unusual it felt to be observed without being judged. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming mug and placed it gently on the table. Ethan thanked her before speaking. "I came back because I realized I never properly thanked you." Claire rested her order pad lightly against the edge of the table. "You already did." "No," Ethan replied. "I thank you for helping with the presentation. I never thank you for changing the way I looked at people." Claire remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Yesterday I walked into this restaurant believing intelligence always came with impressive titles, expensive degrees, and executive offices. I left realizing I had spent years overlooking people simply because I assumed I already knew where talent belonged." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "Assumptions are comfortable. That is why they are so difficult to question." Ethan nodded slowly. "Exactly." A server approached to refill nearby water glasses before quietly moving away again. The restaurant carried on around them with the familiar rhythm of lunch service, yet their conversation seemed untouched by the noise. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple white envelope. He placed it on the table without sliding it toward her. "Before you say anything," he said, "this is not a reward. It is not charity, and it is not a business trick." Claire looked at the envelope but made no move to open it. "Then what is it?" "An invitation." She carefully unfolded the letter inside. It was not an employment contract. It was an offer to fully fund the completion of her engineering degree, including tuition, books, certification exams, and flexible scheduling if she chose to accept. There were no conditions requiring her to work for Ethan's company afterward. No repayment clause. No hidden obligation. Claire read every line twice before quietly placing the letter back into the envelope. "Why?" she asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Because 6 years ago life interrupted your education. That does not mean your future should remain interrupted forever." Claire looked at him thoughtfully. "You do not even know whether I would be good enough after all this time." Ethan smiled. "Yesterday you solved in less than 1 minute what an entire room of specialists could not solve after several hours. I am not worried about whether you are good enough." Claire gently shook her head. "There are many people who need opportunities more than I do." "Perhaps," Ethan replied, "but very few people would have helped complete strangers without asking for anything in return." Claire stared out the window where children laughed while chasing pigeons across the park sidewalk. After a long silence, she looked back at Ethan. If I accept this, I cannot promise I will ever work for your company. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I am hoping you will make whatever choice allows you to become the person you wanted to be before life changed your plans. If that path never crosses mine again, I will still consider yesterday one of the best investments I have ever made. Claire felt her eyes begin to glisten, but she quickly composed herself. She had spent years teaching herself not to expect rescue, not to wait for miracles, and not to confuse kindness with obligation. Yet this felt different. Ethan was not trying to purchase her loyalty. He was simply returning a possibility that circumstances had taken away. She carefully folded the letter once more and smiled with quiet gratitude. Then I will accept one condition. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Only one. Claire nodded. When I earn my degree, I will apply for jobs the same way everyone else does. No special treatment. No shortcuts. If I ever work for you, I want it to be because I deserve the chair, not because you offered it. Ethan stood and extended his hand with genuine respect. Miss Bennett, I would expect nothing less. 1 year later, the first cool breeze of early autumn drifted through Manhattan as Ethan Walker stepped into the glass headquarters of Walker Intelligence for a day unlike any other. The company was holding interviews for a new systems engineering position, and dozens of applicants had arrived carrying polished resumes, impressive recommendations, and carefully rehearsed answers. Ethan greeted each candidate with professional courtesy, but one chair at the end of the schedule quietly held his attention. It remained empty for most of the morning. At precisely 9 o'clock, the receptionist smiled toward the entrance. Claire Bennett walked through the lobby carrying a simple leather portfolio instead of a serving tray. Her posture had not changed. Her smile had not changed. Neither had the quiet confidence that had first caught Ethan's attention inside a restaurant. The only difference was that the dream she had placed on hold for 6 years had finally become real. She had completed her engineering degree with outstanding results while continuing to work evening shifts, refusing special favors, and insisting on earning every exam, every certification, and every opportunity through her own effort. Ethan stood as she entered the interview room, but instead of sitting across from her, he quietly joined the other interviewers. 3 senior engineers led the conversation. Ethan asked only one question during the entire interview. The panel presented Claire with a complex systems design challenge that had frustrated several previous applicants. She studied the diagrams without rushing. She asked thoughtful questions before writing a single note. Then she smiled softly. I believe everyone is solving the wrong problem again. The room filled with gentle laughter. Even the engineers exchanged knowing glances. 40 minutes later, she finished her explanation, not only solving the design challenge, but proposing a simpler architecture that reduced unnecessary complexity while improving long-term reliability. One senior engineer leaned back in his chair. I have been working in this field for 22 years, he admitted. I wish I had thought of that. Another interviewer closed his notebook and smiled. You did not answer the question we asked. Claire looked momentarily concerned. He continued smiling. You answered the question we should have asked. The panel unanimously approved her application before she even left the room. Ethan finally stood and extended his hand exactly as he had promised 1 year earlier. Congratulations, Engineer Bennett. Claire accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. Thank you. You earned every bit of this. She nodded. That mattered to me. Several months passed, and Claire quickly became known throughout the company for the same qualities that had once made her an exceptional waitress. She listened before speaking. She questioned assumptions without embarrassing others. She gave credit generously and accepted praise modestly. New employees often assumed she had spent her entire career inside the technology industry. Very few knew that not long before, she had been carrying coffee through a crowded dining room. One afternoon, Ethan walked through the engineering department and noticed a young intern staring nervously at a complicated report. Claire quietly pulled up a chair beside him instead of taking over the task herself. Tell me what you see, she asked. The intern hesitated before explaining his reasoning. Claire listened patiently, then smiled. You are closer than you think. Start one step earlier. Question the assumption before you question yourself. Ethan watched from across the room without interrupting. The words sounded familiar because they had changed his own thinking long before they changed the young intern's. As he walked back toward his office, he passed a framed photograph hanging in the hallway. It showed the company's newest engineering team standing together after completing a major project. Claire stood near the center, smiling exactly as she had smiled while wearing a waitress uniform. The title beneath the photograph did not mention where she had started. It simply listed her name. Ethan paused for a moment before continuing down the hallway. He realized that success had never transformed Claire into someone different. It had only allowed the world to finally see who she had always been. And from that day forward, whenever someone in the company rushed to judge another person by a title, a uniform, or a first impression, Ethan quietly remembered the afternoon a waitress solved the problem nobody else could see, because true intelligence rarely announces itself. It simply waits for someone willing to look beyond appearances.